Welcome to the Health Detective Podcast. I'm your host, Tiaan, and I'm here with Susan Birch, the Health Detective. This is the fourth episode in the Health Made Simple series, where Susan and I will talk about various topics to help you find simple steps to improve your health. Hey, Susan, how are you?
Hey, Tiaan. I'm awesome. Thank you. Lovely to see you today.
Lovely to see you too. For today, we have a good topic, I think, with many misconceptions, and we hope to cover that and clear that up a little bit. So today, we're talking a little bit about cholesterol.
Yeah, we are. Today we're talking quite a bit about cholesterol, I think.
We're going to deep dive as much as we can, and then let's see where it goes. But let's start off with the basics. What exactly is cholesterol, and why is it crucial for our body?
Well, cholesterol is a waxy substance, sort of like fat, and it's found in all our body cells. And it's also found in some of the foods that we eat, and most people are aware of the animal foods. It's not found in plant foods. We make cholesterol in our liver, and every single cell in our body is capable of making its own cholesterol as well. So that tells us how important it is for our health. It is part of the structure of cell membranes. It's really important for making steroid hormones. So it's a precursor for making things like cortisol, aldosterone, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, all those things that, play such an important role in our body's body regulation. It's a precursor for making vitamin D on our skin. So we've got to have cholesterol so that we can make vitamin D. Other things it does, it's really important in making bile acids, which help us to digest and absorb the fats in our diet. It's crucial for our brain. About 20 to 25% of our brain is made up of cholesterol. And it's helps provide insulation for our brain and spinal cord and peripheral nerves. So despite this reputation that cholesterol has of being associated with heart disease, so, it's bad and everyone talks about it in regard to heart disease, it's actually crucial for our life and for being healthy.
Well, there's a lot to uncover there. There's a lot of stuff that I think we don't even realize that that cholesterol has to do with so many things in our body. But let's start with something a little bit simpler. I think this is something that people are more familiar with in general. And, it's this LDL and HDL levels in our cholesterol. And can you just can we just quickly go down that path and just see how do they play their respective roles in our heart health? Because I think that's the burning question at this point for people in general.
Yeah, that is the burning question. I'll try and be quick. I don't know how quick I will be. One thing we need to understand when we get a blood test and we say we've got our cholesterol test, what our blood test shows, it'll show something called total cholesterol, and then it will show LDL, and it'll have a little c, and it'll show HDL with a little c, and then it'll have triglycerides, and then it will have the ratios. Excuse me. What confuses everybody is that the LDL and the HDL are lipoprotein particles. So because cholesterol is a sort of waxy fat, it can't just go through our bloodstream to get where it needs to go because, fat and water don't mix. So it has to go in these protein particles, which I kind of call the ships, the cargo ships, to get cholesterol, to get transported around the body. So those cargo ships are these lipoproteins. And so we have LDL, which is low density lipoprotein, and HDL, which is high density lipoprotein. What the doctors or what the labs are measuring when they test our cholesterol levels is they're testing how much cholesterol is in each one of these little cargo ships. So I'll just use my little toy here. So just imagine that that's the cholesterol, that's the cargo ship, that's the LDL. And inside of that is cholesterol, but also inside of that are triglycerides and fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins and phospholipids and all sorts of other things that get transported with it. So what happens with cholesterol is in the liver makes up these lipoprotein particles, and they start off as being very big. They're called VLDLs. And when they're a VLDL, most of what is inside of them is triglycerides, fats, okay? And then there's a little bit of cholesterol in there. So they're probably 80% fat and 20% cholesterol, for example. And they go around the body, these VLDLs go around the body, and they drop that fat off to our fat cells and to our muscles and other cells that might need them, but mostly our fat cells and muscles. And as they drop that fat off, they shrink in size. So then they come down, and eventually they get small enough to make this LDL. And so then most of what's inside that LDL, what's left, is cholesterol. The HDL that gets measured, the HDL is also made in our liver, and the HDL is a small lipoprotein particle. It's called a high density particle that doesn't have very much fat or any cholesterol in it, and it goes out in our bloodstream, and it picks up cholesterol and phospholipids and takes them back to the liver to be recycled or gotten rid of. So that's called the reverse cholesterol transport.
So they're like chimney sweepers almost.
Yeah. So that's coming around. Anything that we don't use then goes back to the liver to get recycled. And some of the problems with high cholesterol and what some of the medications do is some people have genetic effects that stop that recycling ability. So then the medication's designed to try and improve it. But we can talk about that a bit later if you like.
Oh, thanks for that. So the LDL and VLD and the HDL, if I got that right, is there a concept of them, one being better or worse or good or bad, or is there anything like that we can say, well, if you have more than this, it's a good thing, or less than that, it's a good thing, something like that?
Well, the problem is that we call LDL bad cholesterol and we call HDL good cholesterol. So even the fact that we call them cholesterol is a misnomer, because the cholesterol that's inside of them, whether it's an LDL or an HDL, the cholesterol that's inside of them is exactly the same. It's the same cholesterol. There's no difference between it. It's the particle, it's the cargo ship that we're talking about. And that's the really hard bit for people to understand. Now, what can happen is, what matters is basically how many cargo ships we've got in the blood, not so much how much cholesterol is inside those cargo ships. So we can have lots and lots of LDL in our blood, and they might not have very much cholesterol in each one, but the total cholesterol might be quite high, even though they don't have much in each one. Or we can have hardly any LDL particles in our blood, and we might have tons and tons of cholesterol in those few particles.
Oh,
So
right.
it's the number of particles that's the problem.
Right. So maybe we should jump to that, because there's the association with this and heart disease. So can you explain the link between the cholesterol then and cardiovascular disease?
Well, that's where it gets really confusing. And, the researchers and medicine, are not so much maybe doctors who aren't familiar with this, but generally the trend is going that it's not the actual cholesterol that's the problem, it's this LDL particle. And when we do our cholesterol test, we don't test for the particle number. We only test for how much cholesterol is inside of that particle. So we can have this thing called discordance, where, like I said, you might hardly have any particles, but they might be really full of cholesterol. So you get you get told that your risk of heart disease is higher because the cholesterol level is higher, but there might not be as many particles. Someone else might have hardly any particles. I might have tons of particles with only a little bit of cholesterol in them, and they get told that their heart disease risk is lower because the amount of cholesterol is lower, but they've got much, much more particles bouncing around at risk of being damaged and creating havoc.
So we should, as best as we can, try to get both of them tested. Is that what I should be taking away?
So there are advanced lipid testing available, so we can test for the particle number. And this is probably a bit, I don't know how necessary this is to explain, but LDL particles have this protein around the outside of them called ApoB100. So that identifies them as an LDL particle. And what happens is you can test for those ApoB100 markers and see how many particles you've got in your bloodstream.
Okay.
But then it gets even more confusing and more complicated, just to add a bit more complexity to it, because you can have big, fat, buoyant LDL particles, and you can have what are called small, dense particles. So there's some evidence to show that the big, fat, buoyant particles are less likely to cause atherosclerosis, whereas the small, dense ones are more likely to get through into that artery wall and start causing inflammation and damage.
Wow, okay.
Then there's another point to make.
But wait, there's more.
Oh, wait, there's more. So then we have what are called oxidized LDL particles. Okay, so oxidization of an LDL particle happens when that cell membrane around the outside, which is made up of phospholipids, which are, fats, get damaged by PUFAs. So omega-6, like vegetable oils, come in and things, and they damage that outside of that lipid structure, and then that makes it oxidized. So when LDL particles become oxidized, they are a lot more atherogenic, and they can get into the arteries and cause damage. Or quite often, they will get oxidized when they are in the arteries. So those small, dense LDL go into the arteries, and then they get damaged inside the artery wall and become oxidized. So that increases our risk of heart disease. But wait, there's more.
It's the gift that keeps on giving.
It is a gift that keeps on giving. And this is why it's so complicated. And this is why there's so much debate and confusion about the whole thing. Now, there's another type of LDL particle, which is called a lipoprotein little a. So it's written as a LP brackets with a little a in the middle. And this circulates around in our bloodstream, and it's got a very similar structure to the LDL, okay? Hope people aren't getting too confused. And this it contains cholesterol and other things just like LDL does, and it is very atherogenic. So that is known to get into our arteries, help form plaques, and is quite dangerous. And it also triggers the increased risk of clot formation as well when it's in the arteries. And the reason it does that is its structure is similar to another protein called plasminogen. And plasminogen releases something called plasmin, which helps break down the clots in our arteries. And what happens is this LP little a looks similar to the plasminogen, and it blocks plasminogen from doing its job and breaking down the clots. So now the clot formation can increase. So one of the problems with Lp(a) and with all the studies that have been done on cholesterol, and when we look at our cholesterol tests, and the confusion between, some studies will show high cholesterol has no effect on heart disease, and others will show that it does. And there's a lot of confusion amongst it. And one of the reasons is because this Lp(a) just gets lumped in with the normal LDL, and it's never been sort of extrapolated out and to see how much of the LDL is actually Lp(a) itself. And that, once research gets into that a bit more, we might find out a little bit more. And we can test for our Lp(a) levels in our body to see what they are, and then try and reduce those.
Wow. Okay, so there's a lot to do there just with LDL and HDL. But are there then any other factors that we should consider when it comes to heart disease, or is that?
Well, there are a lot of other factors. I don't know. Do you have any specific questions about that I could clear up, that maybe people listening didn't really, if you've got questions, they may have questions as well.
Yeah. I mean, we hear often about triglycerides.
Right. Yep.
In conjunction with the cholesterol. And so what is that? And, how do they relate to cholesterol?
So triglycerides are, remember when I said when the LDL, when it's made in the liver, it's called a VLDL because it's big and it's full of triglycerides. Okay, and then so that's what we're testing when we're checking for triglycerides. Now, triglycerides should, after a fast of 12 or 14 hours of not eating, the triglycerides should be quite low. They should be under 0.1. And if they're not, triglycerides are one of the markers of metabolic disease. So if they're over 1, then there's a bit of a problem. And they are what we call a proxy marker for having lots of small, dense LDL. So if you've got high triglycerides, a good proportion of your LDL will be small and dense. And so, you can go and get that checked out with more advanced lipid testing. But that's that's a rough indication that you might have something going on with your LDL.
Okay. And then I guess the next thing is also genetic factors. Does it play a role? And are there certain populations more at risk for cholesterol problems than others, for example?
Yeah, there are genetic factors. There are a number of different genes that affect our ability for reverse cholesterol transport. There are, familial hypercholesterolemia, which is when you've got genetically high cholesterol, and that means that, one of those genes that either is involved in reverse cholesterol transport, or something like the ApoE44 gene that I have, will mean that you'll naturally have a lot higher levels of cholesterol. The ApoB gene, so the gene that is responsible for this, for this attachment on the LDL. Some people have changes in that gene, which means they just make more and more ApoB. So there are genetic factors that influence our cholesterol. Lp(a) is considered to have very strong genetic factors. Siobhan Huggins from the cholesterol code, if anyone wants to look Siobhan up, she has been doing a lot of work looking at Lp(a) and what the other risk factors are for that as well. So those are all things that affect our cholesterol, but then there are other things that affect our risk of heart disease as well. So we see people who have early heart attacks very early in life, and that doesn't always relate to their LDL or their cholesterol. And other markers that we should be looking at are those clotting factors, so how much inflammation is there. So we should be looking at things like fibrinogen and highly sensitive CRP, which is a good marker for inflammation. Now, in New Zealand, you can't even get highly sensitive CRP tested anymore, it's crazy. Things like ferritin. So ferritin is the storage form of iron. And when we get high levels of ferritin, that's an independent risk factor for having heart attacks and strokes or coronary heart disease. Homocysteine is another protein that we can test. And homocysteine is also associated as an independent risk factor for heart disease. So there's a whole lot of other things we need to be looking at other than just looking at how much cholesterol is in our bloodstream.
Yeah, we do. It seems like we sometimes do get a bit of tunnel vision around cholesterol, and when there are so many different factors that we should be taken into account. But we've looked at kind of the mechanism now, which is, you've gone into great detail, so that was really good to get into that a bit more. But when it comes to our diet, how does the fat that we eat affect our cholesterol levels, and then by extension any heart disease?
So it used to be believed that eating cholesterol made your cholesterol worse, and so that's been sort of stepped back now. So you'll find that sort of the American Heart Association and the New Zealand Heart Foundation now say that cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of interest in terms of heart disease. The reason is that when we eat cholesterol, we just don't have to make it in our bodies anymore. And making cholesterol is a hugely expensive operation for our body. So if we can eat it and not have to make it in our cells, our body sees that as a good thing. It's also because dietary cholesterol doesn't really change the amount of cholesterol that we have all that much. But dietary fat does, and saturated fat can, in some people, elevate their cholesterol levels. So you'll find that some people will eat saturated fat and their cholesterol will go down. Some will eat saturated fat, their cholesterol won't change. And then there's other people like me with, special people with special genes, and our cholesterol goes crazy, right? So it gets really, really high. So, I have people come and say to me, oh, my cholesterol is 8 or 9. And I go, yeah, well, mine's kind of 17. So, there's sort of a subpopulation of people with hypercholesterolemia, which have been named lean mass hyperresponders. And I fit into the category of lean mass hyperresponder. So we tend to be people who are normal weight or, normal weight, reasonably fit, exercise pretty regularly, have really good other markers. So we've got a good waist to height ratio. We don't have high blood pressure. We've got really good insulin levels, so we don't have type 2 diabetes. But when we eat a high-fat diet, so if we ate a keto diet, our cholesterol would go crazy, crazy high. And so Dave Feldman from Cholesterol Code has now got a research study out there operating, and they're looking particularly at the subgroup of people. We don't know whether it's safe to eat high fat or not, and that's what this research is trying to prove and identify. But there are lots of us, and Dave has a group of lean mass hyper-responders, and there's many thousands of us who respond in this way, and yet all our other health markers are really healthy. I might have got off track from your question there a little bit.
No. That's quite interesting. So when you say It's unclear on whether a high-fat diet is beneficial or not. Do you mean it's just for this, as you put it, the special people, or is that a more universal statement that it's unclear on whether or not the high-fat diet is detrimental to our health or not?
Well, a lot of researchers, a lot of scientists, and a lot of experts in this field feel that a high-fat diet is not harmful for heart disease. What's harmful for heart disease is smoking. So if you look at your cholesterol or your LDL levels, that's way at the bottom of the list. Smoking is at the top of your list. High blood pressure, having type 2 diabetes, being obese, all those things are much, much higher risk factors than LDL cholesterol by significant magnitudes, not just tiny magnitudes. So the first thing to do is, if you're worried about heart disease, if you've had a heart attack, or if you've got signs of heart disease, is to fix all those things. Those are the things that are really, really key to fix. Now, when we get to the fats, we've also got vegetable oils, right? So we're told to use olive oil, and then we're told to use vegetable oils, because vegetable oils will lower our LDL. And it's true. So if you take saturated fat out of your diet and you replace it with vegetable oils, probably your LDL would come down. Probably my LDL would come down. And the doctors would look at that and go, that's a good thing, that's improving your risk. But like I mentioned earlier, those PUFAs, those omega-6 linoleic acid, they cause oxidation of the LDL. So it becomes an oxidized LDL. So it's actually damaging the LDL. And that's one of the things that's becoming quite clear is too many vegetable oils in our diet. While it may make our cholesterol look better, it might damage that cholesterol and therefore be more at risk, make those particles more at risk. And that's why we need to do better testing,
So when you say those particles are at risk, are we talking increased inflammation or increased heart disease, or
yeah, so they become oxidized? Yes, so there's increased inflammation, they're inside the artery wall. When they're oxidized, inflammatory things happen, and then all these our immune system comes in to try and help clear that up and stabilize that and make that healthy. And then that's how we form these foam cells, and then we form these plaques.
Right. So how often should we get our cholesterol levels checked? It seems like something we should keep our finger on the pulse with. And what do those numbers then mean? I think you touched on some of that quite a bit already, but how often should we get it tested?
Well, I think you want to do it at least once and see where your risk is. Again, it depends on the rest of your health. So if you've got type 2 diabetes, if you've got high insulin, and the problem is that, insulin isn't checked in New Zealand. It's when we check people for metabolic syndrome and diabetes, we don't check insulin. We just check HbA1c. And if that looks all right, we go, oh, you're all okay. But, as we know from our first podcast, Tiaan, insulin is what keeps the glucose down. And you can have really high insulin for years and years and years and start becoming insulin resistant. And if you're only checking your HbA1c, it's not really telling you much about your health. So it's really important to get that insulin checked. I think if you're at risk, for heart disease, you want to get fibrinogen, HSCRP, homocysteine. You want to get all those, ferritin. You need to get all those markers checked as well, not just your LDL, because if you've just got that on a piece of paper, it doesn't tell you much. And then, the levels for what's a problem are coming, they're making them lower and lower and lower. And so you're likely to go in to see your GP, and it might be, 4.5 or 5 or something, or 5.5, and your GP will go, oh, you need to be on a statin. We've got to get this down. You're at a risk for heart disease, without checking anything else, without saying to you, hey, look, your waist to height ratio is really out of whack. We need you to lose some weight to lower your risk of heart disease. Hey, are you a smoker? If you want to lower your risk of heart disease, you've got to stop smoking.
Yeah. So it's almost trying to treat it with a Band-Aid instead of just trying to get to the root cause of many of these issues, from the sounds of it.
Absolutely. A lot of it's to do with, funding and paying for these tests and things. But at the end of the day, we know that heart disease is one of the biggest killers in New Zealand. I forget now, it might be something like 35 women a week die from a heart attack or something like that.
Wow.
It's absolutely enormous. It kills, tens of thousands of New Zealanders every year. Sorry, not every week, every year. So it is a really big risk factor for our health. So why are we not looking at all the markers that we can to figure out what's going on? Why are we just looking at cholesterol, and then we just try and treat it with some drugs, and we ignore everything else?
Well, you touched on statin medication. Can you just elaborate on what that is and how is that used in cholesterol management and the potential side effects?
All right, so I can't provide medical advice at all, so please don't take this as medical advice. I suggest if anyone really wants to understand statin medication, that they look at Dr. Malcolm Kendrick's book, which is called The Plot Thickens. It is an excellent book on cholesterol and statins, so well worth a read, and he's a really funny author, so it's an easy read as well. Nobody's that sure of the mechanism of how statins reduce our risk of heart disease. A lot of people think it's because they bring down inflammation rather than its effect on cholesterol or LDL. So they think that by reducing inflammation, that's reducing our risk. There's a lot of issues with the studies around statins. They use something called relative risk instead of actual risk when they report on the effects of them. And I'm not sure, we may have talked about this before, but that's like saying, you've got 100 people in one group and 100 people in another group, and, this group are given a statin, and, at the end of a year, 2 people in the group without a statin died, and 1 person in the group with a statin died. So that means the difference is a 50% reduction in risk, whereas in actual fact, it was a 1% change. 2 people instead of 1 person died, or 1 person instead of 2 people died. Yeah. So we've got to be really careful about how they present the statistics to us. And so they use relative risks with statins, and I think they claim something like 36%, there's a 36% reduction in risk of having a heart attack. But when you look at the numbers needed to treat, you need to treat sort of like 120 people with a statin for 5 years to reduce one risk of heart disease. So the other thing with statins is there are reports of side effects, muscle pain, dementias, nausea, all sorts of side effects, from very minor to quite serious. Dr. Kendrick outlines those very clearly in his book, and there are other people like Yufi Ravenscoff and lots of other authors out there who also go through the research very clearly and present that evidence. Now, there are a group of people who have already had, say, under 50-year-olds, who, particularly men, who have already had a heart attack, and statin medication is recommended for them to prevent a second heart attack. as far as I can tell, the evidence for that is reasonably good. And that's something you really want to talk to your doctor about. Again, I'm not giving anybody medical advice, but I just say go and do your research. That sounds funny in today's age. But, go and talk to your doctor, go and check out some of the other resources. And when you talk to your doctor, if he says or she says, I think you need a statin, say, look, I'd like to get these other tests done first and see what else might be going on and what might be driving up my risk of a heart attack or a stroke.
Yeah. So statins, are they chronic medication?
You mean for taking long term?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they say once you're on one, you don't come off.
So with that in mind, are there any natural ways or lifestyle changes we can make to help manage or reduce our cholesterol levels?
So rather than talking about reducing our cholesterol levels, let's talk about reducing our risk of heart disease, because that is the whole point of the topic, and that's where it always gets so confusing, and that's where when you read the research and they always go, well, we know that LDL is associated with heart disease, and you go, well, actually, we don't know that. That's just an assumption. So how do we reduce our risk of having heart disease? Well, the first thing I already mentioned is give up smoking. The second thing is looking at that insulin and glucose and HbA1c. Now, if you're insulin resistant, that's highly associated with heart disease. And that comes about from having too many carbohydrates in your diet, more than your body can manage, okay? And, that's a whole nother topic, of course, but more than your body can process and manage. So when you have too many carbohydrates and your blood sugars are full, your liver's full, your muscles are full, those carbohydrates go to your liver, they get converted into triglycerides. So they get converted into fat. That fat then gets stored in your belly fat, goes to your muscle and a few cells to be burned, but mostly it gets stored in your belly fat. So if your waist measurements are increasing and you're getting more and more belly fat and your triglycerides are high, well, that's a huge risk factor. So we already talked about how that is a proxy marker for having small, dense LDL. So let's get those triglycerides down. So you need to reduce the carbohydrates in your diet so that those triglycerides will come down and you can get that insulin down. You need to deal with your blood pressure. And often, one of the causes of high blood pressure is high insulin. So, that's a very common cause. And again, so that's too many carbohydrates, more than your body can personally tolerate. So you want to get that down.
And there's, I guess, cardiovascular exercise.
That's something that exercise. Thanks for bringing that up, because exercise is really important, and it's important for absolutely every aspect of our health, from our brain function. Muscle is our organ of longevity. So, muscle is absolutely essential, but exercise is very important for cardiovascular health as well. Don't think of it as being calorie burning. That's not really the reason. It's needed for improving mitochondrial function and a lot of other aspects of our health and our cardiovascular function. And then we want to do some strength training, to maintain that muscle as well. Because when we've got high levels of muscle, we're going to burn more carbohydrates. We're going to burn more of that sugar that we eat.
Fantastic. So now we're going to have your dream, your vision. But based on the current research that's out there, or let's round it out with this one. Let me put it that way. Based on the current research and trends, how do you see the understanding and management of cholesterol evolving in the next decade?
Well, what I would like to see are GPs get more up to date with cholesterol management. I'd like to see, the New Zealand Ministry of Health actually start to test properly and make testing available to people. I'd like to see much better explanations around heart disease and stroke for people, so that we don't just talk about cholesterol and don't eat saturated fat and put vegetable oils on everything, because, you know, that's not really working. So those are some of the things I'd really like to see happen. And then we've got advanced testing. So, you know, doing those advanced tests for those advanced lipid panels, and then things like having your coronary artery calcium score done. There's CT scans, there's the CIMT, the carotid intima medial thickness tests. The cardiologists have a huge range of tests that they can do if they think you're at that point where, you know, where you might need some further interventions. But starting off in the GP office is get that blood sugar, get that insulin under control, get that weight under control if it needs to be, stop smoking, manage that blood pressure, do some extensive, more advanced lipid testing so you can see what your particle number is, what your particle size is, whether it's oxidized, so that you know that there are lifestyle factors you can take to actually improve that. And then if you need to, you can see your cardiologist and have, you know, more extensive testing and then procedures to help protect you.
That sounds great. I think in essence, it's casting a wider net of the things that we should be looking at when it comes to our heart health.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and if we do all those things to take care of our heart health, then we're taking care of so much of our other health, of our brain health and our muscle health, and, you know, we're taking care of everything, really.
Fantastic. Susan, thank you so much for your time today. This was very informative, very interesting. Thank you very much. Just like to thank you, everybody, for joining in today. We'd like to hear from you. So please drop your questions in the comment section and we can discuss them in a future episode. Also, please like, subscribe, and share this episode with anyone that might find it helpful. The Health Detective can also be found on Facebook, LinkedIn, and all major podcast services. We're looking forward to seeing you on the next episode, where we will have an in-depth conversation about mitochondria. See you on the next one.
That's going to be a challenging one. Thank you, Tiaan. Thank you, Tiaan.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.